I had grown used to standing in the background. For more than 30 years as an infrastructure engineer, I built things people only notice when they collapse. Roads, underground pipes, foundations. When everything runs smoothly, no one asks my name, and I thought family was the same. Until that afternoon when I found myself sitting in the conference room of a law office I had never chosen, a neatly clipped stack of papers placed in front of me, while my son stood across from me as if presenting to a difficult client. He spoke very calmly, almost politely, saying this was just a formality, that everything was ready for the next step, that I had finished my part. I looked at the signature waiting at the bottom of the page, listened to the steady hum of the air conditioner, and realized that no one in the room was waiting for my answer. They had already decided. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised either. Some betrayals don't arrive with shouting, but with a soft voice, full of reason. At that moment, they thought I didn't understand what was happening, that I was old, that I had stepped back, that my role was over. They thought once the foundation was finished, the builder could leave. But there is one thing people standing on top often forget. What keeps everything standing is not found in the most visible place. And when they pushed that paper toward me, they didn't know that I had known for a long time. I had simply chosen to remain silent. I'm not the kind of person who likes talking about the past. What has already happened, to me, is usually just a foundation to move forward from, not something to boast about. But if you don't understand how I got here, you probably won't understand why I stayed silent for so long. I started working as an infrastructure engineer when I was very young, back when my hands were still steady, my back didn't ache, and my faith in the work was still intact. I got used to waking up before dawn, driving to job sites still damp with morning dew, standing among the noise of machines and the smell of drying concrete. I learned how to look at soil, at water, at the things others saw as obstacles, and turn them into foundations for something more lasting. The family company was never a grand dream. At the beginning, it was just a small team, a few local contracts, enough to live on, enough to pay wages on time. I didn't build it to get rich quickly. I built it to last. When my son grew up, I never forced him into the profession. I let him choose for himself, stumble on his own, stand back up on his own. When he came back and said he wanted to join the company, I saw it as a natural continuation. I taught him everything I knew, not just the technical side, but how to keep one's word, how not to sign contracts you don't understand, how to say no when it's necessary. When I began to step back, it wasn't because I was tired. It was because I trusted him. I trusted that I had done enough for him to stand on his own. I trusted that family didn't need constant cross-checking, didn't need suspicion toward one another. I signed the papers, transferred operational control, withdrew from the long meetings. I thought that was how a father shows respect for his son. I thought I was handing over the future, not giving it up. Looking back, maybe my mistake wasn't in giving authority. It was in overestimating the value of my silence and underestimating how others would interpret it. I was used to standing beneath the foundation where no one looks, and I didn't realize that in their eyes, that meant I was no longer there at all. The changes didn't come all at once. They appeared gradually, scattered, so small that if you weren't paying attention, you would convince yourself there was nothing to worry about. First, there were meetings I was no longer invited to. Then came emails that were only forwarded after every decision had already been made. I told myself this was just how things worked when a new generation took control. I had once wanted my son to be confident, and this was the price of that confidence. I accepted it. But then the way he spoke to me began to change as well. Not rude, just quicker, more concise, like the way people speak to someone who is no longer directly involved. "I'll handle it. You don't need to worry about this. Legal has already reviewed it." Every sentence made sense, and precisely because they made sense, I had no grounds to argue. I listened, nodded, and stepped back one more step. Once, I stopped by the office without calling ahead. The space was still there. The sign still carried the family name, but the atmosphere was different. New faces looked at me with polite unfamiliarity, as if greeting an old partner whose contract had already expired. My son was standing at the far end of the room, presenting a plan I had never seen before. When our eyes met, he simply nodded slightly. He didn't pause, didn't introduce me. I stood there for a few more minutes and then left, carrying the feeling that I had just wandered into a place I myself had built. At home, conversations about the company slowly disappeared from the dinner table. When I asked, the answers were always neatly packaged. When I stayed silent, no one asked in return. That silence kept growing, not like a battle, but like a void. And a void is very easy to fill with assumptions. I began to realize that I was being protected from things I had once been the one to decide. Documents arrived later. My signature was mentioned as a formality, not a right. I wasn't angry. I only felt myself being pushed to the margins with politeness. And the most frightening thing about that politeness was how it made you doubt your own perceptions. I wondered whether I was overreacting, or whether this was simply how things ended when a father chose to remain silent for too long. The meeting was scheduled for a weekday afternoon, during business hours, as if it were just another routine appointment. My son said I should come, so everyone would be present. He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask. The law office was located in a glass building, clean, bright, everything carrying the scent of certainty and proper procedure. I arrived a few minutes early, sat down in a leather chair, placed my hands on my knees, and waited. No one looked at me longer than necessary. When they walked in, I immediately realized I was the only one who didn't know the purpose of the meeting in advance. The lawyer opened the file. My son sat up straight, and my daughter-in-law set her bag aside and smiled politely. No one asked how I was. No one asked what I thought. They began talking about restructuring, about efficiency, about the necessary transition for the future. The words were familiar, smooth, as if they had been rehearsed many times. Then the stack of papers was pushed toward me. The lawyer said it was just a formality, a signature to complete the process. My son looked at me and said, in a voice so calm it was almost unsettling, that I had finished my part, that I should rest, that the company needed a new image, a new way of operating. He didn't say it like a son speaking to his father, but like a manager speaking to an employee about to retire. I picked up the paper, dense lines of text, clauses written so they wouldn't need explaining. I asked a single question, slowly. When had this been decided? No one answered directly. They looked at one another. Then my son said everything had been discussed a long time ago, that I didn't need to worry. That sentence landed on the table like a final period. In that moment, I understood very clearly. They weren't asking for my permission. They were informing me. The betrayal wasn't that they wanted control of the company. It was that they believed I was no longer lucid enough to realize I was being pushed out. They spoke about me as if I weren't in the room. They used politeness to mask a decision that had already been made. I didn't get angry. I didn't stand up and leave. I sat there listening to every word, watching every expression. I recognized the confidence in my son's voice and the sense of reassurance in the way my daughter-in-law nodded. They thought everything was settled. They thought once the foundation was finished, the builder could leave without leaving a trace. When the lawyer slid the pen toward me, the room fell silent. Everyone waited, and in that silence, I understood that this wasn't just a signature. This was how they formally placed me outside, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't ask myself whether I was wrong. I thought of only one very simple thing. They were mistaken in believing that my silence meant consent. I left that building alone. There were no goodbyes, no talk of meeting again. The glass door closed behind me so softly it barely made a sound. Outside, traffic kept moving, the city running smoothly as if nothing had just been taken apart. I stood on the sidewalk for a while, not to think, but to breathe. There are moments when, if you don't stop, you won't even realize you've just lost something. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. The familiar dark room, the smell of old wood and paper. I sat down in the chair where I used to review drawings, placed the meeting's file on the table without opening it. I didn't need to read any further. The important things had already been said in another way. I closed my eyes and let the small details I had once overlooked find their way back to me. Interrupted phone calls, answers that came too quickly, decisions made before I had a chance to ask. All of it lined up into a straight line, so clear that I wondered why I had even needed that meeting to understand. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was a strange stillness, like standing underground, listening to water flow above, knowing for certain that it was moving in the right direction. I opened the old drawer where I kept documents no one ever asked about, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. There are things you learn when you've been building long enough. One of them is not putting everything in a single place. I flipped through a few folders and stopped at the clauses I had signed very early, very carefully. At the time, I thought I was simply making the future more orderly. Sitting in the quiet room, I realized what they couldn't see. They were looking at what was running. I was looking at what kept it from collapsing. My silence wasn't the result of being pushed out. It was the distance I needed to be certain that when things began to move, they would move exactly the way I had planned. And that night, for the first time since the meeting, I slept deeply. The next morning, I made coffee, as I always did. No rush, no hesitation. Some decisions don't need emotion to guide them, only a memory good enough to know where you've placed things. When I was still working, I always believed that a durable system never relies on a single point. It needs redundancy. Family, it turns out, is no different. I reopened the folders I had only skimmed through the night before. Old signatures, clauses once considered unnecessary. When the company began to grow, I had heard enough stories about people being pushed out of the very things they built. I didn't think it would happen to me, but I didn't ignore the possibility either. So I kept the things no one paid attention to, the control of the land where the company headquarters sat, the transfer clauses that required final consent, and a will drafted when everything was still calm. They had restructured the company, yes. They had changed the way it operated, yes. But they didn't touch what they didn't consider important. To them, the company was contracts, cash flow, a brand. To me, it began with the land, with the first stones laid when there was no sign, no staff, no lawyers. And those things were still in my name. I didn't call right away. I didn't send emails. I let everything keep running, because when someone thinks they've already won, they become less careful. I scheduled a meeting with only one person, my old lawyer, the one who once said that silence isn't surrender, but the act of preserving your right to choose until you need to use it. We didn't say much. Each. I only needed confirmation that what I remembered was correct. In the days that followed, I received brief notices, updates sent out of obligation. I responded when necessary, and only with sentences just sufficient to keep things calm. They thought I was gradually accepting it. They thought I was preparing to step away completely. And in that sense of reassurance, they didn't realize that power doesn't belong to the one who speaks the most, but to the one who knows when to let the truth reveal itself. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for a moment when every document, every decision, every assumption would stand together in one room under a different light. When that time came, I wouldn't need to explain anything. I would only need to be present. And this time, my silence was no longer a void. It was the answer. The call came one morning while I was watering the plants in the yard. My son's voice was no longer as calm as before. He asked if I was free, said there was a small issue he needed to discuss. I didn't ask for details. I only asked what time and where. This time, he was the one making the arrangements. The room was familiar, but the atmosphere was different. The lawyer sat more upright. The file opened slowly. As the clauses were read aloud, I watched the confidence on my son's face begin to collapse bit by bit. The land, the veto power, the required signatures they had overlooked because they believed they no longer mattered. No one looked at me then. They stared at the documents, as if hoping they would somehow change on their own. My son turned toward me, for the first time since the previous meeting. Hey. His eyes no longer certain. He asked why I hadn't said anything. I didn't answer right away. I only said that I had built many things in my life, and that I knew exactly what keeps them from collapsing. Not money, not promises, but the things that are placed in the right position from the very beginning. There were no loud apologies, only a heavy silence, and within that silence, I stood up and gathered my papers. I didn't need to declare victory. Everything had already spoken for itself. I walked away without looking back, not out of resentment, but because I had come to understand something late, yet necessary. Silence is not disappearance. It is the way a person preserves the right to choose until the truth needs to be placed on the table. I didn't lose my family that day. I simply stopped being the foundation others stood on without ever looking down. And if you are listening to this story, remember that sometimes the only thing you need to do is know where you stand and never sign anything that forces you to leave that place.